It's rib day again here at ChefSteps. I'm here with Joe, and we're cooking Texas spare ribs today. And we're not buckling down into one rib and one tool and one specific way. Joe's gonna take all of his knowledge and expertise and show you how to make amazing Texas ribs, no matter what cooker you've got in your backyard.
I think to me, what a Texas spare rib is, salt and pepper, a lot of pepper to add a little bit of texture. And I think the sauce and that part to me is subjective. You can kind of do whatever you want, but the technique and how to get the bark where you need it to be and to cook it a certain way, and I think the wrap to get to a certain type of tenderness, to me, that's what a Texas spare rib is.
I love it. Let's cook them. Let's cook them and eat them.
All right, so we're getting into breaking down this spare rib, and there's just a couple things that we want to kind of keep in mind. Similar to trimming a brisket, we want to trim off any ends or thin bits that are going to get dry over the course of this cook. And so as you kind of pull on the edges right here, you can see there's quite a bit of thin meat and some fat that's kind of like hanging off the edges. That's definitely going to have to go. And if I flip this over, again, we're just kind of yanking and pulling on the stuff. There's a little bit of extra fat that I want to trim off, and especially on these ribs, we have this kind of like mini skirt. Some people like to leave this on just because it's a little added meat, but this tends to get a little tough during that long cooking process. And also, if you kind of leave this on and you cook it, this will eventually curl up a little bit during the cooking process, and right underneath here, you're gonna get like a bald patch just because you're not gonna get as much smoke as you would on the entire rib. So when I'm trimming this up, I'm always gonna start in the back end. There's just a lot more going on over here that we wanna clean up before we flip it over. So for the skirt, I'm just gonna go by the end right here using the full length of the knife and just kind of pull it up and just kind of keep it close to the rib, just so that we don't leave any lingering bits on the bottom. And we'll leave that off to the side. You know, there's a debate of whether or not you need to remove the membrane. You know, for today's purposes, we're just gonna do so just because I think it eats a little bit cleaner in most cases. And if you end up cooking a little bit too hot, this membrane can become really chewy. So if you guys are a little bit unsure about, managing fires consistently, I would definitely recommend taking that spot off. And you're just gonna try to get right underneath this membrane, right above the bone. And then you're gonna kind of twist your knife so you can kind of lift it up just enough to where, again, you can get a finger, you can get a back of a spoon, something like that, and you're just gonna peel it up. And hopefully, if we do it right, we can get it all in one piece. So you're just gonna run kind of your fingers, your thumb all the way across, and it does get a little bit slippery. So if you're having a hard time doing so, use a dry paper towel and just slowly just get all that lifted off. Sometimes if I'm doing a lot of these ribs, I won't remove them just because it is a little bit annoying to do. One thing that I kind of like about it is it does add a little bit of structure to your rib. So as you kind of cook it, these membranes hold the ribs together a little bit more. So some people like it just because it gives it a little bit more chance to cook it to be a little more tender, just because you have this membrane that gives you a little bit more wiggle room to get that really super soft texture on the rib, if that's what you guys are into. All right, now that we got our membrane removed, it looks a lot cleaner. And the biggest difference that I would say that you have to take off, I think most people are familiar with the membrane, but it's this breastbone that's on this corner of the rib. So if you guys see right here, it's not cartilage, it's actual bone, and it's split with this piece of cartilage that's running right through the center right here. And we're gonna have to take the breastbone off because later on when we go slicing the ribs when they're finished, we're gonna be able to cut through the cartilage, but we're definitely not gonna be able to get through this hard bone. So that's gonna come off and it's gonna make for an easier cook. So the way that I like to do it, I still like to do it with the meat side down. So once I get that, find where that cartilage is, and I know where the angle of that is, I'm gonna basically leave my knife here and kind of give me a guide, or I'm gonna trace out this line. Once I find that line that I like, place my knife right on top, and you should hear a crunch going all the way through. If you're not hearing a crunch and you're just boom hitting a bone, definitely pick your knife back up and move it to a different spot. And then once you get through a cartilage, just drag your knife, and this is what we have right here. We got all this bone off, but then we have these kind of like spots where this cartilage is going to be. Definitely need to cut this off. And there is a big, nice chunk of meat on top of this section as well. This is probably, when we're talking about, you know, how to utilize in most trim and barbecue restaurants for added pork and sausage, this is a chunk that we use a lot just because there's a good amount of fat and good amount of meat on top of there. Generally, when I'm trimming off ribs, and I think this is one of the things that's going to help someone, like if we're in a restaurant and you have an average number of ribs per rack, it makes it really easy for a cutter to be able to tell a customer like, hey, a full rack of ribs is like, you know, going to be 3 pounds or 3.5 pounds, as long as you keep it super consistent. So I always like to count anywhere between, you know, 11 to 13 bones that are really, really good and really even. So from here, because I know I like this bone, I'm just going to count them. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then this 12th one's really small. So in this case, we'll only have 11. But once I decide I'm going to take this bone off, I'm not going to cut it straight down the middle. I'm going to take my knife closest to that bone that I'm going to take off, just so that this rib on the very end is really nice and meaty, so that the person who gets his first bone is going to be really happy with the thick rib. So once we have this, once we find out where the bone is, kind of line your knife up closest to that spot, and then just go straight down. All right. So again, a lot of this meat that we have here is really thin. This bone is super small. Like, this is not something that I would want to serve to a customer, or honestly, even your friends and family. You should not be giving them this bone right here. So that's going off to the side. All right, now that we got all the edges kind of situated, this is where I'm finally going to flip the rib over. This is going to give us an idea of like, now I want to make sure that my ribs are nice and squared off and they're nice and boxy, so that the rib rack is going to cook nice and consistently, that we get a rib on this end and this end to be, you know, as close in size as possible. And if I do so, again, I'm going to pull as much rib meat out as I possibly can and trace a line that is kind of going to give us that boxy shape. And again, we don't want any sharp corners, because any sharp corners, especially for ribs, are going to dry out because rib meat is pretty thin. So as I trace this line, boom, right there, I got a nice uniform shape all the way across. And then from there, we'll take that off. And then stretch out the corners. This corner is really thin, so I'm going to round this one off as well. And this is, you don't have to do this step. This is just more so how I learned how to do a bunch of ribs, you know, working in restaurants. Because again, we want our customers, even if they're getting a really small bone on the end, I'd rather give them a rib that's a little bit shorter and it's cooked well all the way across than give them a really, really long bone where one end is super dry and kind of like, it's just not a great presentation. It doesn't eat very well. And that corner will kind of get like a jerky-like texture, which, you know, I don't think is really great for ribs either. So try to stretch this out again and just round it off as best as you possibly can. And just kind of think about a rib that you would want to eat at the end of the day. All right, so this is our rack of ribs. I'm pretty happy with it. It's nice and uniform all the way across. You know, I got my target of having 11 to 13 bones. It's kind of what I'm shooting for. I don't have any edges that are dried out. They're nice and rounded, and every single rib is going to have a decent amount of fat coverage on top. All right, now that we got our ribs trimmed up, we got the shape that we're looking for, and now we're just gonna simply season them with just salt and pepper. The way I like to season them, I think ribs are a little bit more delicate, and because it's pretty thin, you wanna have that salt control a little bit more consistent. If I'm doing like 100 of them, probably won't be doing it this way, but if you're only doing a couple at home where you wanna control the salt level, presentation-wise, at least for me, for ribs are really important with the glaze and kind of placement of how I like my pepper. I'm a little more picky on that. So with the salt and pepper, I'm gonna do them separately. And with these, because we wanna leave the presentation side last, I'm gonna also season from the bottom side first. I like to season with a coarse black pepper, and I'm gonna start seasoning with the pepper first, only because sometimes when you season with salts, sometimes as it kind of sits up top, things like a coarse ground black pepper might not stick. So I'd rather start with a nice even coat of the black pepper, and then all the spots that are in between, all your finer salt grains will be able to land perfectly just fine. All right. Now that we have our pepper placement to where we want, now we're just gonna go with salt. And on this bottom portion, you know, it's not super important to salt like the membrane and things like that. I think it's important to season everything, but this portion up top where you have a lot of meat right on top of the bone, I would say you definitely want to season this portion properly, because if not, this piece is nice and thick and we want to season both sides nice and evenly. Once we're happy with the placement of the pepper, we got that salt seasoned evenly all across. Now we're flipping over and this is our presentation side. Last quick check that I like to do is anything on the surface. Sometimes there's a little like bits of meat that might be sticking up. This one's pretty clean, so nothing sticking. There's this really small piece that I'm just gonna put off to the side, because if it comes off later, there's gonna be like one random patch in your rib that's gonna be a little bit lighter. It's not that big of a deal. It's not gonna change the flavor or anything. I just don't like it. So with the pepper, because I'm using a shaker, when I'm seasoning it, I'm almost seasoning it from the like an inch or two outside of the ribs on both sides, because if you just try to sprinkle in between the ribs, the way the shaker works, the top and the bottom of your rib is gonna have more pepper on there. Because you wanna season from about here to here so that the pepper that actually lands on the rib is gonna be nice and even. So the wrist motion that we're having is just kind of, it's like a very nice even back and forth. You don't want to like stop or be really aggressive going pushing or pulling. It's just like a really nice kind of just nice even sprinkling, and it really does come with practice. I know it seems so simple that it's just like, yeah, you just have a shaker and do so, but having a nice consistent kind of wave back and forth will allow that spread to kind of like, especially seasoning on high. You can see there's pepper everywhere. It's not really clumping at any spot. There's not one spot that's darker than another. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. And that's what's going to give us a lot of texture on these ribs, but also kind of more of that bite that you would get, or like a spiciness, not necessarily from a cayenne pepper, but from that kind of floral flavor that you get from like a cracked black pepper. Over the top, I'm going to be a little more generous with the salt because there's a lot more meat up top. We don't want it to go too crazy, but just enough coating to right now where it looks a little bit white on top, but it's not coated completely white like you would do with a steak. Because later on, we are going to be adding sauce to these ribs, so we don't want to over season these now. But at the same time, kind of like you would do in any sort of cooking process, you want to season every step of the way. All right, normally when I cook barbecue, I'm used to cooking on an offset smoker, and most people think that you have to have a super expensive smoker in order to create high quality barbecue. But you can still do the same thing and create the same level of barbecue just as long as you understand and follow the same principles as you would with an offset smoker. So today we're going to be using a Weber kettle grill. It's easily accessible, something that you can find anywhere, and there's a lot of different accessories that you can add to it to replicate that same style of cooking. So just like an offset smoker, what we want to do is create as much airflow as possible. And just in the same way, we want to make sure that the heat source is on one side of the smoker, while whatever meat that we're cooking on is on the opposite side. And what we're using today is just this coal basket where we have unlit coals to start, and then we're going to add in a few lit coals to allow it to slowly cook over time. And as we have all these vents open, we'll be able to get as much air circulating there as possible to get heat and smoke circulating, almost like a convection oven. So I'm just going to grab a few coals that are hot, and we're just going to wedge them to the side right here. And as this starts to light, it'll slowly, gradually move over. That way you won't have to refuel your fire over and over and over again because it's burning too fast. And most importantly, when we're setting this up, the holes on the lid are going to be in the opposite side of where the fire is. And where we're talking about fire management, you hear fire management all the time when we're talking about barbecue. Usually when we're talking about big offset smokers, we're talking about using logs and a shovel to move things around. But in this situation, then we're gonna adjust by playing around with the vents on the top and the vents in the bottom to make sure that we create the right level of airflow. And if it gets a little bit too hot, we can close down the vents a little bit. And if it's too cool, either we can add more coals to the fire or we're gonna just open up the vents. So just like any other cooker, we wanna make sure we preheat this almost like you're preheating an oven. So just because the smoker is not that big, you can give it about 20, 30 minutes or so. And we're trying to bring this up to about 230 degrees, 240 degrees, just so it's nice and warm before we put our meat in. All right, now that we got our Weber preheated, we're gonna put the ribs on. We're gonna have the bone side of the rib facing the fire. The reason why we wanna do that right now is the rib tip section on the opposite side has a little bit more fat, and we don't want that to overcook too early in the cooking process. So as we monitor it, the bones are gonna help us to give us a little bit of barrier, and if it gets a little bit too hot, I'm not overly concerned about, the ribs becoming dry. We're gonna pop the lid on, and again, we're gonna keep the lid with the vents right over the ribs. That way, as this cooks, we can get all that heat and that smoke traveling across and leaving over on top of the ribs. Now, one of the things that I want to address when talking about ribs is a lot of people want to spritz the ribs every 30 minutes to every hour. In this cook, we're not gonna do any spritzing at all until maybe the 3-4 hour mark. We don't want to spritz ribs too often just because it's gonna wash off a lot of our bark and our color, and it's not gonna allow us to get those bright red colored ribs that most people are looking for. And if you open the lid and you're spritzing too often, it's just gonna extend your cook time on ribs way longer. And just for the sake of having a faster cook, building a better bark, having better color, we're just gonna leave it closed and monitor our temperature about 240 to 260 degrees for the first 3 to 4 hours. And the different stages of our cook, our first 3 to 4 hours, we're really just trying to build good color and also render some fat that's lingering inside of a rib. Especially in the rib tip section, if you don't render out that fat, that section of the rib can be really, really chewy, and then the cartilage in there will be really hard to bite through, and we don't really want that in our rib. After the initial 3 or 4 hours, once we got all that good color that we're looking for and that fat is starting to render, is when we're gonna start to add additional flavors to it. So at that point, we're gonna add a nice glaze to it, let it set to get nice and sticky and build more color, and then we'll wrap the ribs up for another 30 to 45 minutes so that we can get them nice and tender. After that, we'll let them rest for about 30 minutes just so that our ribs are at a good place where we can slice them, because if we don't let them rest and we cut them too soon, they'll shred like pulled pork. And right now we're shooting for a cooking temperature about 240 to 260 degrees. All right, so at this point, our ribs have been cooking for about 2 hours or so, and our fire has definitely died down, so we need to add some more coals. And as you guys can see, like, the coals have become a lot more ashy. There's not really any more heat that's coming out, so we definitely add a couple more wood chunks to get a little more smoke in there. And at this point, because it's still fairly warm, all we need to do is add some unlit briquettes to it. That way it'll slowly start to build up temperature again, and then the wood chunks that we add in there will give us that continuous smoke. So the way that I'm gonna kind of rebuild this fire, I'm gonna try to get rid of, kind of give us a light shake. That way we can see all those coals that still kind of exist, and we're gonna put our unlit coals on top of it. And then we're gonna leave some that are not right next to it, because again, it'll slowly start to burn and kind of give us a little bit longer of a cooking time. And just like we did earlier, we're gonna take one of these wood chunks and then again, put it on the opposite side where it's a little bit cooler, just because we don't want this to catch on fire. But eventually we do want it to start kind of producing smoke for us. You can see right away, as soon as we put those unlit coals in there, all the kind of lighter coals at the bottom are already starting to burn and are going to bring that temperature back up right away. So the setup is still the same. We got the ribs on the opposite side of our fuel source. The way that our pepper that we placed earlier is nice and even, and it's going to give us a nice contrast. And the ribs are starting to get that really nice red color from that smoke and that heat that's coming up. But it's not quite ready yet. And even though at this point you might be tempted to take your spritz bottle and spray your ribs, don't do that. You're at this point, this is not like a brisket where it has a fat cap on top where that fat's going to render. So your ribs are going to look kind of dry for a while, but what we're really, really looking for is all that fat that you kind of see laced in between all these ribs. We're trying to get to a point where that starts to render, and it'll start to make our ribs look a little bit juicier and a little bit more like glossy just from the rendered juice and fat. So until that point, we're going to keep it closed, keep our temperatures consistent, and we'll check on it in a couple more hours. So it's about 3 hours since we started this cook, and now we're gonna just do a quick check on these ribs to see where they're at. We also have ribs on 2 other cookers, on a PK and a green egg, and I just wanna show you guys how we set up these fires in all 3 of them and just to see how they cook. So first on our Weber, we still have to add a little more coals here. The fire's kind of died down, but sometimes like when I'm a little bit nervous about adding more coals because I don't want to spike the heat up too much, but it still needs a little more air. I just keep around with me this portable fan, and all we're really doing is kind of just introducing a little more air if those coals just need a little more help. So if it gets super, super smoky, but you don't want to add more coals to your coal basket, just give it a little more time, give it a little more air, and you know, after a few minutes, put the lid on, and if it's still dying, then it's probably a good time to add more coals. Just because our wood chunk has gone fire, we're just gonna kill that wood a little bit. Always have that spritz bottle just handy, especially with these wood chunks. Now let's take a look at these ribs real quick. At this point, we haven't spritzed these ribs with anything at all. All it's been is just getting temperature from our coals, a little smoke from our wood chunks, and that's what's really developing the color on these ribs. But the one thing that we're looking for and to add a little bit of moisture to the ribs is, like we talked about earlier, with all these kind of like white lines where right now they're kind of more yellow at this point just because of all the smoke that's kind of collected. We're waiting for these spots to really, really pull out a lot of bit of fat and moisture and kind of like glaze the surface of these ribs. So this spot right here, you can kind of see if I squeeze down on there, there's a little bit of juice that's starting to come off. Like these spots that are fat, if I like look at my fingertip, it's starting to get a little more glossy. So that's a good sign that we've taken the time to render out that fat. This edge is really thin, so you know, this one's a little bit darker, but the one thing it's telling me is even though this is really, really thin, sometimes when you cook too hot, this thing will kind of curl up. So the fact that it's not curling up too much is giving me an indication that temperature-wise, we're doing okay, but we still probably need maybe another 30 minutes or so until these are ready to sauce. So next is our PK, and as you can see, the design of this grill is a lot different than our Weber. Instead of being round, it's a lot longer, but it's also more narrow. So trying to fit this rack of rib in here is a little bit of a challenge. I'm trying to figure out the best way to do so, so we kind of put it at an angle. But at the same time, we're still trying to use the same concept of an offset smoker where we got heat on one side and we left the vent over here wide open just so we can get all that smoke and all that heat to travel across the rib. And this one, as you can see, there's a lot more fat on this rib than the one that we had previously. And you can kind of see those little kind of like bubbles that are coming on top right there. And there's a little bit more moisture. If I were to tilt this over a little bit, you probably will see some of this liquid just running off like right there. So that's what we want to see at this point. We want to see some of that juice, some of that fat starting to kind of roll off. And that's what's going to allow us to get a juicy rib without having to spritz our rib with a bunch of liquid. Just the way that this rib is situated and it's across this way, and obviously this corner is closer to the fire, so there is a little bit of pullback on these ribs, but I'm not overly concerned, only because I know that the ribs on this side are a lot thicker than the ribs over here. So I think right now we're doing pretty good. Later on, if I feel like this side is getting way more done than this side, I might flip them, but I'm pretty happy with the way they look at this moment. So last one is on our green egg. This one initially kind of took us a while to get the fire started, but because it's a ceramic and holding a lot of heat, once we got the temp up, it was rocking at a good cooking temperature that we're looking for. So this rib is actually the biggest rib that we have, but in my opinion, I think this is the best rack that we have on so far. It seems like there's a lot more going on. You can kind of see how the ribs in between these bones are starting to plump up a little bit. That's giving us a good indication that they're starting to cook a little bit more than the other ones. You kind of see right up top right here, if I squeeze it, there's a lot more juice, a lot more fat rolling off of this one. So I think the biggest difference between the rack of rib that's on this one opposed to the Weber or the PK is the rib is a lot bigger. So because it's bigger, I think it can handle a little more heat, and there's obviously more juice that's coming out of it. And you know, when you're trying to select a rib, finding ones that are a little bit bigger can definitely be beneficial because it can handle a little bit more heat. But you also have to keep in mind that if you don't cook it hot enough, it will end up being really, really chewy. So I think this is kind of what we're looking for. This is the one that's looking the best out of all of them so far. And we're just gonna let it go for a little bit longer to get a little bit more color, hopefully render a little bit more fat, and then I think soon they'll be ready to glaze. All right, the one other thing that I wanna check to make sure my ribs are ready to go is look at the bottom of the ribs. So if I flip this over, you can see that how right underneath there, you see all that juice and all that fat that's starting to run off. We have great golden color underneath. We got smoke and all the way across the bottom as well. And this top portion is where that rib tip is. And there's a lot more fat in this section. And one of the tests I like to do is kind of like a squish test. And you can kind of see in this top section, as I give it a squeeze, all that juice that's starting to run out. That's what I'm looking for. That's going to give me an idea of the fat underneath that rib is starting to cook out. And as it hits that fire right there, it's a good sign. And so that's what we're looking for. And looking at that top section of that rib, where that rib tip section is, where there's a little more fat, that's also where the cartilage is going to be. And that's the part that at this point, we want to get a little more ahead. Because if that part isn't tender yet and it's not starting to render fat, it's most likely gonna not be tender even though we wrap them in ribs. So because of the rib tip section feels that way, that's a pretty good indication for me in about 20 to 30 minutes or so. Once you render just a little bit more fat, get a little more color, that's when we're gonna start glazing these ribs. All right, so just after looking at the green egg and how well that one looks, I kind of want to go back to the smaller rib. And you know, as we look at this one, it doesn't have that same color that we're looking for. It also doesn't have that same fat rendering that we got. If I squeeze the top of that rib, you can see there's like no moisture that's coming out. So it still needs a little bit more time. It's getting close, but it's still much, much tighter than the other rib. And I think that has to do with the fact that just the green egg, it just holds in a little bit more heat, while this one is a little, like the metal is a lot thinner and a lot of heat has just been escaping during this cook. And we're having to refuel this a lot more, which just means opening and closing the door way more often is really slowing down this cook time. So even though all three of these ribs went on pretty much the same time, and the Weber actually got up to temp the quickest, the PK kind of was really slow, and same with the green egg. But those other two held temp a lot better once they got up, and they're a lot juicier and they're way more ahead. So you know, when you're cooking barbecue, there's just a lot of factors to think about. Depends on like what temperature you're cooking, depends on how well your cooker is holding the temperature, and there's just so many factors that come with barbecue. So when you're cooking barbecue, that's why it's really important to cook by these cues of, you know, by visual cues, by feeling things. I need the smell of it, like the one in the green egg and the PK, it almost smells like a roasted pig, while opposed to this one, you kind of just get more of that charcoal smell. So when you're cooking barbecue, use all your senses and don't just base everything on time. Now that our ribs are getting close to being at a point where we can glaze our ribs, we want to take any type of barbecue sauce that you guys like. And you know, for me, ribs are very subjective. Some people like their ribs really sweet. Some people like them really spicy. Some of them like them super glazed and just like covered in sauce. But for today's ribs, what we want to do is kind of create a nice glaze on top of them. And this is more of a way that we cook ribs in Texas, where it's a thinner sauce and the consistency is nice and smooth, so that like you can get a good mix of this nice sticky rib, but it's not overly sauced. And for the sauce that we're going to be using today, like this consistency of the sauce is kind of what we're looking for. It's a little bit runny, but it's still fairly sweet. It has a good amount of acidity to it. So it's a little more balanced in terms of a barbecue sauce. But for an example, we're gonna take a sauce that's a little bit thicker and kind of thin it out. So for those of you guys who have barbecue sauces that have maybe more molasses, more sugar, and it's quite thick, we want to be able to take the sauce that you guys really like and still apply that same technique to it. So the way that we're going to thin out this barbecue sauce is just adding a little bit of apple cider vinegar to it. And especially if you guys have a sweeter sauce, I think it's a great liquid to use just because it brings a little more tang to it. And at the end of the day, I feel like when we're trying to create sauces, we're looking for something that's sweet, spicy, tangy, all those good things. And just to show you the consistency of this sauce, you can see it's quite thick. And that has to do with a lot of like ketchup or tomato paste, a lot of sugar, a lot of molasses that makes it really thick and gloopy. And when you have like these chunks of sauce that you're gonna glaze onto your ribs have these like pockets of sauce that you know, kind of get dark on one side and they over reduce. And if you cook a little bit too hot, actually can create a bitter flavor. So we're gonna thin this sauce out for right now. So we're just gonna add a little bit of apple cider vinegar to it just to start. And take a whisk. And if you don't want to add apple cider vinegar, if your barbecue sauce is still very acidic, you can use a little bit of water to it as well if you don't want to add more vinegar to your sauce. So as I'm mixing this sauce in the bowl, I'm looking at how much sauce is sticking to the rim of the bowl as I'm mixing it. If there are these big chunks of maybe tomato paste or ketchup, trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. Also just seeing that it's just like all that pulp that might be in there, those like thick pasty pieces, that's a little more smooth as we kind of add more vinegar or other liquids to it. Now it seems like the texture on top is a lot smoother than it was before, and there you go. That's a little bit more the consistency that we're looking for, where it just runs really smooth. We don't have giant clumps of sauce anymore. All right. And then, so if we just see on the back of the spoon, it still coats. Like it's not a super just watered down sauce. Like we still want it to be coating the back of the spoon. We just don't want it to be super, super thick where the back of our spoon is that really dark ruby red. And again, if you wipe the back of the spoon, again, your sauce should still be sweet, but it has a nice tang, has nice acidity. And also as the sauce kind of reduces, it will intensify a little bit. So if it's really strong and really, really sweet to start off with, and we cook it down and create that glaze, your ribs are gonna be really, really sticky and maybe overly sweet at that point. Now that we got the sauce to the consistency that we want, now we can transfer it to a squeeze bottle like we have here, or or you can use a brush with a cup and just so that we can be really controlled with the amount of sauce. The only thing that we don't want to happen is have like piles and pools of sauce on top of our ribs while they're being cooked. All right, so now we're checking on these ribs that we got in our Weber. We're looking at these right now. They have, that color is nice and dark now, and it has that gloss that we were looking for. Again, we didn't spritz these at all, but there is a little bit of liquid pooling. If I tip it over, there's some juices that are dripping off, and that's a sign for me that these ribs are ready to get glazed up. So again, we're just gonna get that light coat on there. Brush it lightly with our fingers, covering every single inch. And we're gonna knock off the excess, and you can already see just how much richer of a color that is, even though we didn't throw that back in the smoker yet. And this is something that I didn't talk about earlier, but even just that light peppering that we see right now, it kind of enhances the color of the rib a little bit. You can kind of see how that pepper is kind of speckled throughout, and it almost shows a little bit more in terms of presentation once we got the sauce on there. So these will go back on the Weber, and we'll let them sit and glaze for about 15 or 20 minutes. All right, these ribs have been glazed and been sitting in here for about 30 minutes or so. Everything is really nicely kind of caked on there. It's not running anymore. It kind of has that nice gloss and sheen to it. And that rib tip section is a lot softer than it was before, so that's great. So anytime let's say on these thinner ribs towards the end of the cook when they're glazed and this part's feeling a little tight, you can always turn the ribs around just to even out the cooking just a little bit to get more heat on this area that has a little more fat on it. But to me, these things are ready to wrap. Just get a little bit of apple cider vinegar down first, just so that as we add the sauce, it can kind of move a little bit with a little more liquid. So again, not too much because the ribs are already sauced. Spread the sauce around so it's covering the entire rib. And then we'll go meat side down again. Bring the sides over. And again, with these ribs, we're making sure it's long enough that we can fold both sides and we don't have any air gaps, just so we can make sure it's nice and tight. So unlike the other ribs that we saw in the green egg that were a lot thicker and felt a lot juicier, because these felt a little bit tighter and I feel like they need a little bit more time in this kind of moist environment cooking. So these will probably go on for 30 to maybe 40 minutes or so, again, until we do this rib test. And again, if you see this right now, it's very, very stiff. And so we definitely want to get it to where the meat is a little more tender. Those rib tip sections feel a little bit more tender and soft and squishy. We're going to put this back on the Weber. And just to help along this side, we'll put the rib tip section closest to the fire to get a little more heat and get this entire rib nice and tender. All right, so rib tips are going to be towards the fire. So these ribs have been wrapped up for about 30, 40 minutes or so. It's like we talked about, probably need a little bit more time because they were tighter. So we're going to check for the doneness. Okay, so as we see this rib right here, and we're again holding it with our two middle fingers, giving that flop, and it's relaxing a lot more, and that's what we want, especially with this rib being pretty lean and not having that much meat on the bones. Like, you want it to be a little bit more relaxed. And then if we squeeze the rib tip section right here, it's a little bit looser, and if I push a little bit between the bones, I don't want to break through the foil right now because it still has all that apple cider vinegar, has that sauce, probably a little bit of the rendered fat from the pork ribs still kind of sitting in there. I'm going to rest these just enough so that we can hold these ribs without it burning our hands, and then these should be ready to cut. All right, so all these ribs are rested, and we have our 3 different ribs from 3 different cookers. So we got our ribs from the green egg, our ribs from the PK, and then from our Weber. And just to kind of do a quick overview of the cook, we started them off uncovered. We didn't spritz them. We didn't do anything to them for about 3 to 4 hours or so, just allowing the heat and the smoke to get that rib a nice bright red color and to render that fat. Then we added a nice glaze that was thinned out so we can get a super glossy finish on those ribs. And if they needed a little bit more time to tenderize, we wrapped them in foil and put them back on a heat for about 30 to 40 minutes or so. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna open up all these ribs just so we can see the comparison to all of them, to see if the color is any different, to see how tender they are. And yeah, and then we'll be able to taste them afterwards. So when we're opening up these ribs, basically taking the same steps but backwards, we're going to open up this one flap and the one on the bottom and then the sides. And because we have the ribs that are meat side down at this time, when we flip them over like this and kind of rub that rest of that sauce that's on top just so we can get a nice clean rib. Okay, we're going to open these up, and again, these are for the PKs and a little bit smaller, and that section up top feels really nice and tender. So again, we're going to take these ribs, flip them over. This is from our Weber, the one that kind of took us the longest. It felt like it was a little bit leaner than the other 2 ribs, but at this point, they feel nice and tender. I think they might have a little bit more chew to them, but in terms of the cook, it was exactly the same, just a little bit more time, just because it needed it. So when I'm looking at all 3 of these ribs, the color looks great. I mean, this is exactly what we're looking for. Even though at this point, a lot of the color is coming from the sauce, but even the sauce is getting, like, the smoke from the ribs is getting the sauce like a really ruby red color, which is what we're looking for. But also, even though the sauce looks and the ribs look a little wet, it's not like we doused them in sauce. It was just a lot of different layers with that glaze and the little extra apple cider vinegar that we added, and also coming from like the juices from the ribs and the fat that are starting to kind of cook out and like sit in the foil as it rests. So we have this right here. We got a flop, but it's not breaking. So if the ribs were breaking at this point, then we definitely overcooked them. But after the rest, it has some structure to it, which gives me an indication that later on when I go to slice this thing, it's not going to just completely fall apart. And then even when I tip it over, all the sauce, there's a little bit that's running off, but most of it's kind of caked on there. And that's what we're looking for. And if I'm looking at these ribs right now, this rib right here has kind of like the most pull back. And I think one of the mistakes that people make are when they're looking for their doneness of ribs is they're always looking for the pullback off the bone. But a lot of times when that happens, most of the time your ribs are overcooked. So if it does happen, it's kind of like an A+, but don't make that the reason or the thing that you're looking for a lot of times. Like luckily, these are pulled back. We have a little pullback on these not so much, but I know that these are done. Again, the checks that we're looking for are on that rib tip section, that it's nice and rendered and squishy, that we have that nice flop on the ribs, because that's going to give us an idea of the toughest rub to cook right in the center with that flop. And you can clearly see we got great color in all these ribs. One thing to notice on this center rib right here, this has nothing to do with where it was cooked on, but because this rib in the center has a little more fat, it's obviously going to look a little discolored, but that's just because the rib has a little more fat. And honestly, it'll probably taste better because of that layer of fat. So don't always go by ribs on how they look. Obviously, we want them to look really good and glossy, but at the end of the day, the most important thing is that we cook them properly. All right, so we're gonna slice these ribs up. And for cutting ribs, I like using basically a bread knife that's serrated. I feel like it just helps to kind of cut through the bark just a little bit more. And then just because you have a longer blade, you have a nice, really clean rib on the side. Now, a couple things, it's not that hard to cut a rib, but you know, obviously the hardest thing is to avoid bones sometimes. So when you cook them, we're always looking for where the meat is kind of raised in between the bones, and that kind of gives us a guide of where to cut through. And we just want to make sure that, you know, if we happen to hit a rib, don't try to just saw through a rib, pick your knife up and just kind of, you can turn it to a slight angle, and it might not be a clean, exactly straight up and down cut, but at least you'll get all the meat out of the bone. And you know what, if you hit a bone, it's not the end of the world. Just throw the bone away and eat the rest of the meat. And if I'm looking at this, I can kind of see how the ridges and the meat that's raised in between the bones, it's not exactly straight up and down. It's kind of at an angle this way. So I'm going to start with this end rib over here, and then find the space in between the bones, and find that ridge, and then again, nice clean cut. And the hardest part sometimes can be if you overcook the rib tip, or maybe during some part of the cook, this part got a little bit too hot. Sometimes the fat underneath here can kind of cook out a little bit and kind of peel it off. So if that does happen, just kind of hold it down with your finger. Make sure your fingers are out of the way, and take a little short sawing motion to break through it. And then once you get through, the rest of the rib should be super clean to cut through. And as you get towards these last bits, sometimes these bones kind of turn in a weird way. So if that happens, it's not a big deal. Just try to still follow that same angle. So with this rib right here, we got that slight smoking on the outside. And I like the fact that the entire rib is not super smoky and isn't pink all the way through, because I think that might be a little over smoked. But we also have all this juice that's coming out of this rib right here. And that just tells us that we cooked it low enough. We cooked it at the right temperature where we're running out all that good fat, but not cooking out all that delicious flavor that we're looking for. So we're going to call in Grant, and he's going to taste these ribs with me.
I want to try. I'm here, Joe.
Yeah, man.
All right.
Go for it.
These are pretty.
Very good.
That's some pretty color, super juicy.
Yeah.
All the wetness is sticking to the ribs. It's not like soupy ribs.
It's not super soupy. It's not super thick. It's kind of the right medium, where it's not also like syrupy, sticky. Right. What's your favorite rib on a rack? Do you have one?
Are we just gonna try this one? This is PK or Weber?
This is the green egg.
Green egg, and then PK, and then Weber.
Correct.
I don't know. I'll just try one of these like fat guys over here.
Go for it.
You have a favorite rib?
I like the ribs that have like the smaller pieces of cartilage.
Yeah,
in there.
I like the little gnarlies because they got a little more of the fat too. These are nice
Yeah, that's
looking
a big
short
one.
ribs. What's up, Kemp? You want to try? Cheers, brother.
Cheers.
Lighter than it looks.
I think it's because we didn't put in so much sauce. And also it's just layering just enough so it holds, but it's not like we added sauce after it was cooked, and you don't really need it either.
And this, to me, is like my favorite doneness, where it comes off the bone, but you still have to like bite it and pull it off. I don't like when it slides, and I don't like having to gnaw. That's like so perfect. So I like we got one kind of Texas style spare rib, and you're chasing it down in 3 different tools. I like that.
Yeah. And again, like the technique, I would say the sauce itself is not Texas style at all. It's a little bit sweeter,
It's crispy.
but
I
think the amount of pepper kind of balances everything out. And I personally, even in Texas, they don't use sauce, but I think ribs need a little bit of sauce. It needs a little bit of sweetness because of all that like fat that's in there too. I think having some sweetness and some tang, it creates a different experience. You know?
They're so good.
Subscribe to our channel and visit ChefSteps.com for more tips, recipes, guides, and tools to help you level up in the kitchen.